5 men crossed a fence on a remote mountain property. They ignored the warnings, they laughed at the signs, they vandalized the land and threatened the woman who owned it. 72 hours later, they were gone. No bodies, no blood. Just abandoned trucks and a silence that made search teams nervous. The woman who lived there had documentation, alibis, and a past nobody knew about. What happened in those mountains was never proven, but after that, no one ever crossed her fence again. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories about quiet strength and the consequences of crossing the wrong person, please consider subscribing. This is a story about boundaries, respect, and what happens when people mistake silence for weakness. The drone footage swept over the Bitterroot Range at dawn, capturing ridge after ridge of granite peaks that looked like broken teeth against a pale sky. The wind was the only sound, no roads, no power lines, no signs of human life except for a single dirt track that wound through the valley like a scar, ending at a modest cabin built into the hillside. The land stretched for miles in every direction, raw and unforgiving, the kind of place where nature made the rules and people were just passing through. Embry Castellane had purchased 640 acres of this remote mountain wilderness 18 months ago. The realtor had been honest about the problems. Poachers had been using the land for years, treating it like their personal hunting ground. The previous owner had given up trying to enforce boundaries. Too isolated, too much terrain, too few consequences. Embry had listened to all of this, nodded once, and signed the papers without negotiation. She paid in cash. She asked no questions. She gave no explanation for why a woman in her mid-40s would want to live alone on a mountain 12 miles from the nearest neighbor. The property line was marked more clearly than most surveyed land in the county. Every 50 yards, a fence post stood with a metal sign bolted to it. Private property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. The signs were professional, weather-resistant, impossible to miss. Trail cameras were mounted on trees at strategic intervals, their solar panels catching the morning light. The cabin itself sat at the highest defensible point on the property, with clear sight lines down the access road and across the open meadow that surrounded it. Anyone approaching would be visible long before they arrived. Embry walked her property line every morning. She moved with an economy of motion that suggested years of physical discipline. Tall and lean, her frame carried no excess weight. Her hands were calloused and scarred, the kind of wear that came from work and something harder to name. She checked each fence post, each sign, documenting everything in a weathered notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. When she found boot prints crossing the boundary line, near the eastern ridge, she stopped. Her face showed nothing. She photographed the prints from multiple angles, measured the stride length, noted the tread pattern. Then she moved on. The locals called her that woman who bought the Morrison Range. She drove into town once a month for supplies. She spoke to no one unless necessary. At the general store, she paid in cash, loaded her truck efficiently, and left without small talk. The cashier had tried asking where she was from. Embry had replied with a polite smile and no information. After a few months, people stopped asking. She became another piece of the landscape, noticed but not understood, present but not participating. Her routine was precise. Morning coffee was made the same way every day, water measured exactly, grounds weighed on a small digital scale. She did 30 pull-ups on a bar mounted in the doorframe, her form perfect, breathing controlled. She ran the perimeter of her property, 5 miles of steep terrain, and returned barely winded. Firewood was chopped with textbook efficiency, each piece the same size, stacked in geometrically perfect rows. A hunting rifle hung above the fireplace, cleaned regularly though she was never seen hunting. Topographical maps covered the table by lamplight, elevations and sight lines marked in pencil. The way she entered her own cabin revealed something most people would never notice. She cleared angles instinctively, her hand moving to her hip, where a sidearm would be carried. She slept on a cot positioned to see both the door and window, not the bed. A single photograph sat on the mantel, face down. The cabin was sparse but organized, everything in its place, nothing unnecessary. It was the home of someone who had lived out of a rucksack for years and never quite adjusted to permanence. 3 days after she photographed the boot prints, her trail cameras caught something. 3 trucks rolled past a clearly posted no trespassing sign without slowing. Through. The dusty windows, men with rifles were visible, laughing about something. The timestamp showed late afternoon. The GPS coordinates placed them 8 miles deep on her property. Embry sat in her cabin, watching the footage on a laptop, her expression unchanging. She rewound the video, watched it again, froze the frame on a license plate and zoomed in until the numbers were clear. Then she opened a drawer. Inside was a satellite phone she had never used. It sat in its original packaging, the battery charged, the account active. She stared at it for a long moment. Her hand hovered over it. Then she closed the drawer without picking it up. Instead, she opened another notebook, this one filled with entries dating back months. Names, vehicle descriptions, patterns, timing. She added the new information in neat handwriting. At the bottom of the page, she wrote a single line. Day 147. First warning posted. Then she closed the notebook and returned to her maps. The hunting camp was professional. 5 men in their 30s to 50s had set up 8 miles inside Embry's boundary line, far from any road, deep in terrain that required ATVs to access. They had portable butchering stations, high-end rifles, expensive optics. These were not amateurs. The camp was organized, efficient, clearly the work of people who had done this many times before. They field-dressed an elk with practiced movements, no wasted motion, no hesitation. One of them tossed an empty beer can into the stream. Another walked to one of Embry's property markers and urinated directly on it, laughing as he did. The radio chatter was casual, dismissive. Breck, the leader, was in his early 40s, weathered and confident. He mentioned the new signs on the fence line with amusement. Harlan, older and more cautious, asked if they should be concerned. Breck laughed. Nobody was enforcing it. Some city woman bought the land, plays mountain hermit. She was not going to do anything. Cullen, the youngest, at 30, was cocky. She probably did not even know they were there. Breck agreed. Even if she did know, what could she do? The sheriff was 3 hours away on good roads. Forest Service would not come up here for trespassing. They had been running these mountains for 15 years. Nobody had ever stopped them. The problem was not new. Cascade County had 2 deputies covering 2,400 square miles of mountainous terrain. Response time to Embry's elevation was 4 to 6 hours, assuming the roads were passable and the weather cooperated. For a misdemeanor trespassing complaint, the priority was low. The previous landowner had filed dozens of reports over the years. Nothing had changed. The poachers knew the math. They understood the reality. Law enforcement was theoretical at this distance. Consequences were abstract. Boundaries were suggestions for people who chose to respect them. Embry's cabin glowed with lamplight that night. She sat at the table reviewing maps, read, pins marking every location where trail cameras had caught trespassers. 17 pins. Each one represented a documented violation. Each one represented a choice to ignore clearly posted warnings. She opened the locked case she kept under the bed. Inside was equipment that did not belong in a civilian home. Night vision optics, range-finding binoculars, a tactical vest with a faded insignia barely visible in the dim light. Her hand hovered over the vest. She paused, motionless for several seconds. Then she closed the case without removing anything. But she opened another drawer. The worn moleskin notebook was different from the others. She flipped through pages of handwritten notes, names, vehicle descriptions, movement patterns, frequency of violations, behavioral observations. She had been watching them for months, learning their habits, counting how many times they ignored warnings. At the bottom of the latest page, she wrote in careful script, Day 147. Final warning. Posted. Then she set her watch alarm for 4 in the morning and sat in the dark, waiting. Over the next 2 weeks, the violations escalated. The trail cameras caught the same trucks returning, now with a 6th man. Embry posted new signs with explicit language. Active surveillance. All trespass documented. Law enforcement notified. The poachers' response was captured on video. One of them used the sign for target practice, shooting it repeatedly while the others laughed. The footage showed them setting up a semi-permanent camp, building a fire pit, leaving trash scattered across the meadow. They were no longer passing through. They were claiming the territory. Embry made the drive into town, 45 minutes on rough roads. The sheriff's office was small, understaffed, overwhelmed. Deputy Freeman was in his late 20s, tired eyes suggesting too many shifts and not enough support. She approached the counter and slid a folder across. Inside were printed photographs, license plate, numbers, timestamps, GPS coordinates. Her voice was quiet and controlled when she spoke. 5 men. Been on my property 43 times in 4 months. Names and addresses are there. They are poaching. Freeman glanced at the paperwork with the expression of someone who had seen this before and knew how it would end. He promised to add it to the report. Sheriff Tannick could send someone up, probably next week when he was back from Billings. Embry repeated the timeline. Next week. Freeman looked uncomfortable. It was a big county. The resources were stretched thin. He suggested carefully that maybe she should consider selling. That was rough country for someone alone. He caught himself mid-sentence, realizing how it sounded. Embry asked him to finish the thought. For what? Freeman backtracked. He just meant it was a lot of land to manage alone. She took her documentation back, turned to leave. Her voice was quiet when she spoke again. I will manage it. As she walked out, she passed. A bulletin board covered in community notices. Among the flyers for yard sales and lost pets was a missing person poster, Gerald Pritchard, last seen hiking the Sentinel Range. The photograph showed a man in his 50s, smiling, healthy. Embry stopped. She studied the poster for several seconds, her expression shifting in a way that was difficult to read, something between recognition and decision. Then she left without another word. 4 nights later, the trail cameras caught something different. The poachers were inside her fenced perimeter, within 200 yards of her cabin. The timestamp showed it was nearly midnight. 1 man urinated on her porch, another spray-painted profanity on her shed. The audio picked up their voices clearly. Let's see if the woman comes out. They shined spotlights at her windows, engines revving, deliberate intimidation designed to frighten her into leaving. The harassment continued for 20 minutes. Inside the dark cabin, Embry sat motionless. The curtains were closed, but she watched the light sweep across her walls through a narrow gap. She did not move, did not react, just watched with the patience of someone who had spent years in positions where movement meant death. After the trucks finally left, engines roaring in triumph, she stepped outside. The damage was documented methodically, photographs from multiple angles, measurements, notes. Then she went back inside. This time, when she opened the locked case, she removed items with deliberate precision. The tactical vest came out first, its faded insignia catching the lamplight for just a moment. A seal trident, worn but unmistakable. Night vision monocular, range-finding binoculars. The topographic maps were spread across the table. A different notebook emerged, smaller and black, filled with technical calculations, elevation corrections, wind pattern analysis, sightline geometry, range estimations for specific terrain features. She began marking the maps with surgical precision, using a protractor to calculate angles from high points on the mountain. Embry Castellane had not always lived alone in the mountains. For 12 years, she had been part of something most people never knew existed. The flashback was brief, fragmented, desert landscape shimmering in heat. Younger version of herself in tactical gear, eye pressed to a rifle scope. A spotter beside her, voice calm, wind shifting, adjust 2 clicks right. Radio chatter, multiple hostiles, civilians in the compound. Her voice steady and emotionless. I have the shot. Radio confirmation, clear to engage. Her finger on the trigger, the slight recoil. Radio again, target down, hostages are moving. Nice work, Castellane. She had 27 confirmed kills across 3 tours, a congressional decoration she never attended the ceremony for. She left the Navy SEALs in 2018 with an honorable discharge and a single request to be forgotten. The military had honored that request. Her records were sealed, her operations classified, her name scrubbed from public databases. She had bought land in the most remote location she could find and built a life based on distance and discipline. She had not been hiding. She had been choosing peace. But peace required boundaries, and boundaries only mattered if they were enforced. The small rucksack was packed with precision: water, energy bars, first aid kit, rope, the black notebook, a pencil. She checked her rifle, a civilian bolt-action hunting rifle, but the way she handled it told a different story. Each movement was muscle memory, decades of training compressed into unconscious competence. She loaded 5 rounds, chambered 1. In her notebook, she wrote a final entry. Day 147. Final entry. All warnings exhausted. Proceeding with territorial defense. She set her watch alarm for 4 in the morning. Then she sat in the dark cabin and waited for dawn. When the sun rose, Embry left the cabin with the rifle slung across her back and the pack secured. She did not walk toward the road or down the mountain. She walked up into the densest terrain, following paths that did not exist on any map. Her movements were deliberate, purposeful. This was not hunting. This was positioning. The camera did not follow her into the wilderness. The screen faded to black. A title card appeared. 72 hours later. The radio chatter that emerged 3 days after Embry disappeared into the mountains was panicked and confused. Different voices, all frightened. Breck was not answering. His GPS showed his truck still at the old camp, but he was not there. Cullen had missed check-in 6 hours ago. His phone went straight to voicemail. Harlan was not responding either. Someone suggested going up to look for them. Another voice, shakier, said no. Something was wrong. They should call the sheriff. The hesitation in that voice suggested they knew, on some instinctive level, that going up the mountain was a mistake. They would not survive. From which city in the world are you watching this story unfold? If you have ever known someone who quietly held a line when no one else would, someone whose silence was mistaken for weakness, share your thoughts below. And if this story has made you curious about what happened in those 72 hours, consider subscribing, because the answer is something that would haunt these mountains for years to come. Sheriff Tannick was 55 years old and had seen enough in Cascade County to know when something felt wrong. The radio call came in at 6 in the morning, multiple missing persons, all experienced hunters, all last known to be in the same general area of the Bitterroot Range. He drove up the mountain road with Deputy Freeman, passing Embry Castellane's property line, marked with those clear, professional signs. The truck was quiet except for the sound of gravel under the tires. Freeman broke the silence first. "How many are we looking for?" Tannick kept his eyes on the road. 3 confirmed, not responding. 2 more have not been seen in 4 days, all hunters with permits for the adjacent national forest. Freeman hesitated before speaking again. They might have crossed onto the Castellane property. Tannick repeated the word slowly. Might have. The implication hung between them. They both knew what trespassing meant at this elevation. They both knew how little the law could do about it. What they did not know yet was what Embry Castellane could do about it. They found the first truck before noon. Breck Holloway's vehicle sat in a small clearing 8 miles from any maintained road, doors hanging open like broken wings. The keys were still in the ignition. 2 rifles leaned against the hood, unfired, safeties still engaged. A coffee mug rested on the hood, liquid still pooling at the bottom, though it had long since gone cold. There was no blood, no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, just the overwhelming sense of absence, as if the men had been erased mid-action. Tannick walked the perimeter slowly, studying the ground. Freeman checked the radio inside the truck, still tuned to their frequency. Last transmission was 3 days ago. Gonna check the ridgeline. Nothing after that. Tannick crouched near the truck, examining boot prints in the soft earth. Multiple sets, all leading away from the vehicle, not walking, running. The stride length was too long, the depth too deep. These men had been sprinting through dense forest, away from something. He looked up at the mountain rising above them, miles of terrain that could hide anything. Get search and rescue up here, and get me Embry Castellane. The drive to her cabin took another 40 minutes on roads that barely deserved the name. Tannick had called ahead, but received no answer, which did not surprise him. When they arrived, Embry was outside, splitting wood with an axe. She saw the patrol truck coming and set the axe down, wiping her hands on her jeans. She did not look surprised. She did not look worried. She looked like someone who had been expecting this visit and had prepared accordingly. The cabin was exactly what Tannick expected, and nothing like it at the same time. Sparse but organized. Clean floors despite the muddy season. No signs of recent activity beyond normal daily living. The rifle above the fireplace was in its case, and when he asked to examine it, she handed it over without hesitation. It smelled of oil, but not gunpowder. The barrel was clean, the action smooth. It had not been fired recently. Her boots sat by the door, clean and dry, no mud, no debris. Everything about the scene suggested a woman who had not left her property in days. Tannick explained they were looking for missing hunters, 5 men. Had she seen anyone on her property in the last few days? Embry walked to her laptop without a word and pulled up trail camera footage. The timestamps were clear. 4 days ago. 3 trucks entering her land, ignoring. Posted signs, men with rifles visible through the windows. She showed more footage, the harassment at her cabin, the vandalism, the spotlights and shouting. The audio was crystal clear. Let's see if the woman comes out. Tannick watched the footage twice. She slid a folder across the table. Inside was documentation going back months. Photographs, license plates, dates and times. Names and addresses she had researched herself. A copy of the police report she had filed with Deputy Freeman 2 weeks earlier. Her voice was calm when she spoke. These men have been trespassing for months. I documented everything, filed reports, did everything by the book. This footage is from 4 nights ago. They came within 200 yards of my cabin, vandalized my property, threatened me. After that, I did not see them again. Tannick asked the question that mattered. You did not see them leave? Embry met his eyes directly. I stay inside when they are on my land, for my safety. It was a perfect answer. Reasonable, defensible, impossible to challenge. Freeman asked what she did after they left. She gestured to the shed visible through the window. I cleaned the graffiti off, documented the damage, considered filing another report, but I did not think it would matter. The implication was clear without being accusatory. She had done everything legally possible and received no help. Tannick asked if he could look around. Embry said she would prefer a warrant, but if it would help find the men faster, he was welcome to search. It was exactly the right answer from someone with nothing to hide. They searched for 30 minutes, found nothing suspicious. No hidden gear, no recent mud tracked through the house, no evidence of anyone preparing for or returning from anything in the wilderness. On the table sat the moleskin notebook, the one with the trespassing documentation. Freeman picked it up with permission and flipped through months of careful logs. The final entry was dated the night of the harassment, day 147. Filed report with county sheriff. No response. Vandalism occurred, cleaned and documented. You keep detailed records. Tannick said it as an observation, not an accusation. Embry replied without emotion. When people ignore your boundaries, documentation matters. I learned that in the service. Tannick caught the reference immediately. You served? There was a pause, brief but noticeable. She met his eyes. I did. What branch? Navy. What did you do in the Navy? The pause was longer this time. She knew what he was really asking. She knew he was fishing for information he would not find in any public database. Her answer was simple and final. My job. The silence that followed was heavy. Tannick knew there was more. He knew she was not telling him everything, but he also knew he had nothing to leverage, no evidence to pursue, no legal ground to push harder. He thanked her for her cooperation and told her to call if she saw or heard anything. She said she would. As they walked back to the truck, Freeman spoke quietly. She did something. I know she did. Tannick opened the driver's door. Prove it, Freeman started to argue. We should check something. Tannick cut him off. Check what? 640 acres of wilderness? She has documentation, a paper trail showing months of harassment, and she let us search without a warrant. We have nothing. The search operation that followed was massive by county standards. Search and rescue teams combed 40 square miles over the next 6 days. Helicopters swept grid patterns using thermal imaging. Cadaver dogs tracked through dense terrain that fought them at every turn. Volunteers from 3 counties joined the effort. Tannick coordinated from a command tent, maps covered in search grids that grew more complex each day. They found the second truck on day 2. Same story, abandoned, keys inside, no blood, rifles left behind, equipment scattered but no bodies. The third truck appeared on day 4, even deeper in the forest, miles from any logical route. It was as if the men had been driving in circles, panicked and disoriented. Inside one truck, they found a journal. The final entry was barely legible, written in shaking handwriting. Something is out there. We need to leave. Now. The timestamp on a dropped phone showed the last activity was 3 days ago. A failed call to emergency services. No signal, no connection. Just the attempt, logged and abandoned. Search teams reported strange observations. The dogs would track a scent for miles and then stop, confused, circling the same spot as if the trail simply ended in midair. Experienced trackers found boot prints that suggested the men had been running blindly through the forest at night, stumbling, falling, getting back up, and running again. There were signs of falls, broken branches, disturbed ground, but no indication of what they were running from. One team leader radioed back with frustration in his voice. It is like they just vanished. Tannick stood in the command tent on the 6th day, staring at the map. 40 square miles searched, hundreds of man-hours invested, 3 vehicles found, equipment recovered, but no bodies, no blood, no trail that led to anything conclusive. The operation was costing the county resources it did not have. The state police were asking questions about justification. Families were demanding answers he could not provide. He made the decision to scale back the search to a monitoring status. If anyone stumbled across something, they would respond. But the active grid search was over. 3 weeks after the search was suspended, a Forest Service ranger named Yael Ostrander was surveying fire damage in the adjacent national forest. She was 5 miles from Embry's property line, marking dead trees for removal, when her dog started barking at a ravine. The animal was trained and disciplined, not given to false alerts. Yael climbed down carefully, using roots and rocks for handholds. She found a boot first, then a backpack, then something that made her reach for her radio with shaking hands. The crime scene was processed by state police. 4 bodies, scattered across 3 miles of terrain, but all in the same general drainage. The medical examiner arrived by helicopter. Initial assessment took 6 hours. Detective Sayers was 50-ish, a state investigator who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing until now. He walked Tannick through the preliminary findings. 4 bodies. Been here at least 2 weeks, maybe 3. Primary cause of death appears to be exposure, hypothermia. But there are complications? Tannick asked what kind of complications. Sayers pulled out a tablet showing the body locations marked on a topographic map. They died close together in time, within hours of each other based on decomposition rates, but in different locations spanning 3 miles. That is unusual for exposure deaths. Usually people die where they stop moving. These men were still moving when they died. Tannick studied the map. All 4 locations showed the men had been moving away from Embry's property line, fast. Sayers pointed to the injury reports: fractured ankles, broken fingers from falls, deep lacerations from running through dense brush. These men were not hiking, they were fleeing. Tannick asked about cause of death. Sayers shook his head. That is the strange part. No gunshot wounds, no blunt force trauma, no stab wounds, no obvious signs of foul play. Toxicology will take weeks, but preliminary examination shows elevated cortisol and adrenaline. These men were terrified when they died. They ran themselves to exhaustion in the dark, fell repeatedly, kept getting up and running until their bodies gave out. Tannick looked at the terrain, steep, unforgiving, dangerous at night. But these were experienced outdoorsmen. Sayers agreed. That is what makes this unusual. These were not panicked tourists. These were professionals who knew how to survive in the wilderness. What about the 5th man? Tannick asked. Harlan Vickers. Still missing? Sayers looked at the map, at the pattern of where the bodies were found. If he followed the same pattern, he could be anywhere within a 10-mile radius. Or he could have gone the other direction entirely. We will keep looking, but given the terrain and the time elapsed, the chances of finding him alive are 0. That night, Tannick sat alone in his office, unable to let it go. He pulled Embry's initial police report, overlaid it with the missing persons files, studied the map showing where the bodies were found. All 4 had been on national forest land when they died, but the terrain analysis suggested they had entered from Embry's property and were moving away from it when they succumbed. He opened his laptop and ran a background check on Embry Castellane, previous address in Virginia Beach. Employment history listed as Department of Defense with details redacted. That was significant. DOD did not redact details for administrative positions. He searched deeper, looking for anything that might explain who she really was. He found a news article from 2017. Local Navy SEAL honored for service in anti-terror operations. No photograph, no name, details classified. But the date and location matched Embry's service timeline. He found another article from 2018. Navy to review rules of engagement after controversial operation. SEAL team member cleared of wrongdoing. Again, names redacted. Again, the dates aligned. He tried accessing military service records and hit a wall. Classified, sealed, unavailable to local law enforcement. Without federal clearance he did not have. But he found one thing buried in a congressional database, a Medal of Honor nomination that had been downgraded to a Navy Cross. The recipient was listed only as Chief Petty Officer E. Castellane. The citation was completely redacted. Whatever she had done was so classified that even the description of her actions was considered a security risk. Tannick sat back in his chair and stared at the screen. He understood now. Embry Castellane was not a veteran. She was a ghost. Someone who had operated at levels most people did not know existed. Someone trained to eliminate threats with precision and disappear without trace. Someone who understood terrain and psychology and fear in ways that could turn a mountain into a weapon. He looked at the map again, the pattern of where the bodies were found, the way the men had died running in terror from something they never escaped. He knew what had happened, but knowing was not the same as proving. The next morning, he drove back to Embry's property alone. No deputy, no backup. This was not an official visit. He found her chopping wood again, the same steady rhythm, the same precise movements. She saw him coming and set the axe down. They sat on her porch without speaking for a long moment. Finally, Tannick broke the silence. We found them. 4 bodies. National Forest, 5 miles from your boundary. Medical examiner says exposure, hypothermia. They got disoriented, separated, panicked. Embry said she had heard the helicopters. Her voice carried no emotion, no relief, no concern, just acknowledgement. Tannick continued. That terrain they were in, it is brutal, easy to get turned around in the dark, especially if something spooked them. Embry replied that she would not know. She stayed close to home. Tannick pulled out a folder and set it on the table between them. I did some reading last night. Navy Cross. SEAL Team 3. 12 years of service. 27 confirmed kills. Honorable discharge in 2018. Embry did not react, did not confirm or deny, just waited. There was an operation in 2017. Yemen. Hostage rescue. 8 SEALs went in, 3 did not come back. But 12 hostages survived because one sniper took out 7 hostiles from positions nobody thought were possible, shooting through walls, through vehicles, from angles that required impossible precision. Tannick paused. They wanted to give you the Medal of Honor, but the operation was classified, so they downgraded it to a Navy Cross and buried the file so deep that even I can barely find traces of it. He leaned forward. You know what I think happened up there? I think those men came onto your land. I think they harassed you, vandalized your property, threatened you in your own home. I think you documented everything by the book, filed reports, did everything right. And I think when the law could not protect you, you protected yourself. Not with violence, but with fear. I think you went into those mountains and made 5 experienced hunters believe something was hunting them. I think you used every skill you learned in 12 years of special operations to turn your property into a place so terrifying that grown men ran themselves to death, trying to escape. The silence stretched between them. Wind moved through the pines. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called. Finally, Embry spoke. Is there a question, Sheriff? Tannick asked directly. Did you kill those men? She met his eyes without hesitation. No, period, I did not kill those men. It was not a lie. Technically, it was completely accurate. Did you do anything that resulted in their deaths? Her answer was measured, precise, legally perfect. I defended my property within the law. I never fired a weapon at another person. I never laid a hand on anyone. What happened to them happened on federal land, miles from my boundary. They chose to run. They chose to panic. I cannot control what people do when they realize they have made a terrible mistake. Tannick stood, picked up his folder. For what it is worth, those men had records. Breck Holloway had 3 domestic violence arrests. Cullen Mays was under investigation for illegal game trafficking. Harlan Vickers did 2 years for aggravated assault. He looked at her. They were not good people. But they were people. Embry replied quietly. Yes, they were. Tannick walked toward his truck and stopped halfway. One more thing. That Medal of Honor that got downgraded. I read between the lines. 7 targets in under 90 seconds, in a sandstorm. From positions that required you to move 3 times without being detected. You saved 12 people that day, and the country could not even thank you publicly. So, I will say it. Thank you for your service, Chief Petty Officer Castellane. She nodded once. Tannick got in his truck. Before closing the door, he added one final thing. That satellite phone you own. The one registered to a DoD contractor. If there are any call logs on it, now would be a good time to make sure there are not. Their eyes met. She understood. Already taken care of. He drove away. After his truck disappeared down the mountain, Embry walked into her cabin. She opened the drawer with the satellite phone. 1. Outgoing call in the log. 4 days ago. Duration, 4 minutes. A single saved contact. Falk. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she deleted the call log, removed the SIM card, walked outside with the pieces, used a rock to smash the SIM into fragments too small to recover data from, buried them in her garden beneath the tomato plants. 6 weeks later, Harlan Vickers' body was found 18 miles away, across the state line in Montana. The report came through official channels. Bear attack, partially consumed. The injuries were consistent with running through dense forest at night. Multiple fractures, deep lacerations from falls, signs of severe hypothermia before the bear found him. The medical examiner noted defensive wounds were minimal. The victim may have already been unconscious when the animal encountered him. The official conclusion was added to the case file. 5 experienced hunters entered unfamiliar terrain at night, became separated, panicked, succumbed to elements, tragic accident, case closed. Have you ever witnessed injustice that the law could not touch? Have you known someone who found another way to draw a line that mattered? Share your thoughts below. And if you want to know what happened to that mountain, to those boundaries that were crossed, and to the woman who made sure they would never be crossed again, stay with us. Because the resolution is not what anyone expected. The newspaper headline ran in the County Gazette 6 weeks after the last body was found. Poachers die in mountain wilderness. Exposure deaths ruled accidental. The article was brief, clinical, focused on facts that raised no questions. 5 men entered unfamiliar terrain. Weather conditions deteriorated. Communication failed. Search and rescue efforts were extensive, but ultimately recovery became retrieval. The county coroner expressed condolences to the families. The sheriff's office declined further comment. The case was closed with the bureaucratic finality of paperwork filed and forgotten. But in the bars and diners of the valley, in the hunting camps and Forest Service stations, a different story circulated. It moved through conversations in hushed tones, shared over coffee and knowing glances, passed between people who spent their lives in the mountains and understood what could not be said in official reports. 5 men went onto that woman's land. Professionals who had been hunting those mountains for 15 years. They ignored the signs, laughed at the warnings, and 3 days later, they were running through the forest in the dark, terrified of something nobody could name. 4 died of exposure. The 5th was found 18 miles away, partially eaten by a bear after hypothermia had already taken him. The question nobody asked officially, but everyone considered privately, was simple. What had they been running from? The medical examiner's report mentioned elevated cortisol and adrenaline, physiological markers of extreme fear. These were not men who had gotten lost and calmly succumbed to the cold. These were men who had been hunted by something that never touched them, but drove them to exhaustion and death through sheer terror. The details leaked slowly through the community. Boot prints showing they had been running, not walking. Equipment abandoned in places that made no sense. One man's journal with a final entry that simply read, "Something is out there. We need to leave now." Written in handwriting that deteriorated from neat script to barely legible scrawl across 3 words. The Forest Service quietly updated their maps, marking Embry's property with notations that suggested caution. The hunting forums online filled with speculation and warnings. Whatever you do not cross that fence line. The woman up there is not what she seems. Some claimed she had set traps. Others suggested she had used psychological warfare techniques. A few whispered about military training and capabilities that went beyond anything civilians understood. But nobody had proof. Nobody had evidence. There were only the bodies, the terror that had driven them, and the woman who lived alone on a mountain with boundaries that had suddenly become absolute. Detective Sayers from the state police spent 3 additional weeks trying to find something actionable. He interviewed everyone who had known the deceased men. He reviewed every piece of evidence collected from the scene. He studied Embry's background as much as classified restrictions would allow. He found nothing that would hold up in court. No weapon discharged, no physical contact, no threats made. Just a woman who had documented months of harassment, filed official complaints, and then remained on her property while 5 men entered her land and died on federal territory miles away. His final report concluded with the same determination. Accidental death by exposure. No evidence of criminal activity. Case closed. But Sayers added a note to the file that would never be included in official records. In my professional opinion, these men encountered something on or near the Castellane property that induced extreme psychological distress. Whether that something was natural, predator, environmental hazard, or human intervention cannot be determined from available evidence. What is certain is that experienced outdoorsmen with decades of combined wilderness experience exhibited panic behavior inconsistent with their training and background. The note was filed separately, marked for internal review only, and eventually buried in archives where it would gather dust alongside thousands of other cases that defied easy explanation. Spring came to the Bitterroot Range with the slow transformation that high elevations demand. Snow receded from the lower meadows first, revealing grass that had been dormant for months. Wildflowers emerged in patches of purple and yellow. Deer returned to graze in the open areas, wary but persistent. The mountain remembered winter but released its grip incrementally, day by day, as if reluctant to let go of the silence that cold brought. Embry walked her property line as she always had, checking each post, each sign, documenting everything in her weathered notebook. But something had changed in a way that was immediately visible to anyone who understood the patterns of these mountains. The boot prints that used to cross her boundary were gone. The trail camera footage showed hunters approaching the fence line, reading the signs, and turning back without argument. Some took photographs of the warnings as if documenting evidence of their compliance. Others made wide circles around her property, adding miles to their routes rather than risk even accidental trespass. The game trails that crossed her land showed increased animal activity. Elk that had avoided the area for years returned to their traditional migration routes. The wolves that had been displaced by human presence reclaimed territory they had abandoned. The mountain was healing in ways that statistical analysis could measure, but struggled to explain. She stopped at a section of fence where someone had added an unofficial warning. The spray paint was crude, but the message was clear. Turn back, private land. She means it. Below it, in different handwriting, someone had added, 5 men did not listen, 5 men died. Embry studied the additions for a long moment. She did not remove them, did not paint over them. They served a purpose she had not intended but would not discourage. The fence posts stood straight. The signs remained intact. Not a single one had been damaged in 6 months. The mountain had learned something that could not be taught through law or logic. Boundaries were real when enforced by someone willing to make them real. The change was measurable in ways that extended beyond Embry's immediate property. The hunting pressure across the entire sector decreased noticeably. Guides who had previously worked these mountains began routing their clients to different areas without explanation. The usual conflicts between landowners and trespassers, which had occupied significant law enforcement resources every season, simply evaporated in this region. Sheriff Tannick noticed it in his incident reports. Deputy Freeman commented on it during their regular patrols. Something had shifted in the fundamental understanding of what boundaries meant in this part of the county. The local bar 6 months after the incident was busy on a Friday night. Hunters preparing for the fall season gathered to share plans and check regulations. The walls were covered with decades of photographs showing successful hunts, trophy animals, groups of men proud of their skills and their harvests. But among the newer photos, there was a noticeable gap. Nobody was posting pictures from the Morrison Range anymore. The conversation around the old wooden tables was animated, covering weather patterns and game movement, and equipment recommendations. But when someone mentioned Sector 7, the area that included Embry's property, the conversation quieted. Two men sat at the far end of the bar, studying a map spread across the scarred wooden table. The younger one, maybe 25, with the confidence of someone who had grown up hunting but had not yet learned the mountain's harder lessons, traced a route with his finger that cut close to Embry's property line. The route made sense from a topographical perspective. It followed natural game corridors and avoided the steepest terrain. It was the kind of route experienced hunters would take without thinking twice. But the older hunter, weathered and careful with the scars of 3 decades in these mountains visible on his hands and face, grabbed his wrist hard enough to stop the motion. "Do not," the younger man protested. "It is just adjacent. We would not even be on her land. We would stay on the national forest side. It is legal." The older man shook his head firmly, the gesture carrying weight that went beyond simple disagreement. "You do not know the story." The younger hunter leaned back, irritated but curious. "What story?" "Everyone keeps talking about that woman like she is some kind of monster. She is just a person. She has property. We would not trespass. What is the problem?" The older man took a long drink from his beer before answering. He chose his words carefully, the way people do when they are walking the line between truth and discretion, between what happened and what can be proven. 5 men went up there 2 years ago. Best hunters in the county. Breck Holloway had been guiding for 20 years. Harlan Vickers could track anything that moved. Cullen Mays knew these mountains better than most people know their own neighborhoods. They were not amateurs. They were not stupid. They were professionals who had been crossing that land for years, long before she bought it. He continued, his voice dropping. Slightly so, the rest of the bar could not hear clearly. They thought some woman living alone could not do anything about them trespassing. Thought the fence and the signs were empty threats. She filed complaints. Nothing happened. They kept coming back, got bolder, started treating her property like it was theirs. Then one night, they went up to her cabin, vandalized it, threatened her directly, shined lights in her windows trying to scare her. The younger hunter interrupted. "So she called the cops, right?" The older man smiled without humor. She had already called the cops. Multiple times. "You know how long it takes to get law enforcement up there? 4 to 6 hours if the weather is good. By the time anyone arrived, those men would have been long gone." "So, what happened?" the younger hunter asked, leaning forward now, his earlier confidence replaced with genuine interest. The older man folded his hands around his beer. 3 days after they harassed her at her cabin, all 5 of them disappeared. Their trucks were found abandoned, equipment left behind, no blood, no bodies at first. Search and rescue spent a week combing 40 square miles. Eventually, they found 4 of them scattered across 3 miles of national forest, all dead, all showing signs of running through dense brush in the dark, broken bones from falls, lacerations from branches, hypothermia. The medical examiner said they died of exposure. The younger hunter processed this. So, they got lost, had an accident. Why is everyone treating it like she did something? The older man leaned in closer. Because these were not men who got lost. Harlan Vickers could navigate by stars. Breck had GPS units and maps. They knew these mountains. But something made them run. Something scared them so badly that they abandoned their vehicles, their weapons, their supplies, and fled into the forest in the middle of the night. They ran until they could not run anymore, until their bodies gave out, until hypothermia took them one by one across miles of terrain. And the thing they were running from never fired a shot, never touched them, left no tracks, no evidence, nothing the sheriff could investigate. The silence at their table stretched. Other conversations continued around them, but their corner of the bar had become an island of quiet tension. Finally, the younger hunter asked the question that mattered. What was she? The older man took another drink. Former military, special operations, Navy SEAL, sniper. The kind of person who spent 12 years learning how to eliminate threats without leaving evidence. The kind of person who understands terrain and psychology and fear in ways most people never imagine. She left the service and bought the most remote property she could find because she wanted to be left alone. He unfolded the map and pointed to a different route, one that swung wide around Embry's property, adding 5 miles to their planned hunt, but avoiding any possibility of crossing her. Boundaries. This is where we hunt. This is where everyone hunts now. Because that woman up there drew a line and made it clear what happens when you cross it, not through courts or lawyers or police reports, but through consequences that are final and absolute and impossible to argue with. The younger hunter stared at the map. You really think she killed them? The older man refolded the map carefully. I think she did not have to kill them. I think she made them kill themselves through panic and fear, and running from something that was always one step behind them, but never quite caught them. And that is somehow more terrifying than if she had just shot them. They packed up their gear and paid their tab. As they left, the younger hunter looked back at the map one more time. The older man put a hand on his shoulder. Some lessons you learn from other people's mistakes. Those 5 men learned that boundaries matter, that warnings are not suggestions, that a woman alone is not the same thing as a woman helpless. We get to learn that lesson without paying the price they paid. The bar door closed behind them. Inside, the conversations continued, but the Morrison Range was not mentioned again that night. The Forest Service office showed the statistical change most clearly. Ranger Yael Ostrander, the same ranger who had found the first bodies and would never quite forget the sight of them scattered across that ravine, stood before a map marking poaching incidents across the district. The data covered 10 years, color-coded by severity and frequency. Every sector showed consistent activity, the usual patterns of illegal hunting that plagued public lands adjacent to wilderness. Except one. Sector 7, which included Embry's property and the surrounding national forest, had shown regular violations for 9 years. Red marks clustered thick across the map, each one representing a confirmed incident of illegal activity. Then, 18 months ago, the marks stopped, not gradually. Not with a declining trend, they simply ceased. The sector went from one of the highest violation areas to 0 incidents in the span of a single season. Another ranger, younger and less familiar with the history, asked what changed. Yael pointed to a single date on the graph. That is when Embry Castellane bought the Morrison Range. The room went quiet. Everyone present knew the stories. Everyone had heard the speculation. Some had participated in the search and rescue operation. They had seen the abandoned trucks. Some had been present when the bodies were found. They understood what the official report said and what the unofficial truth suggested. Someone asked if they thought she was responsible for the drop in poaching. Yael chose her words with diplomatic precision. I think boundaries started mattering in that sector. I think people realized there were consequences for treating posted private property as public access. I think whatever the reason, we have our first 0 poaching year in that sector in over a decade. And from a conservation perspective, that is unequivocally positive. She pulled up additional data. Wildlife populations in Sector 7 have increased measurably. Elk herds are using traditional migration routes they had abandoned. Wolf packs have re-established territories. Even the smaller indicators, bird populations and plant diversity, show improvement. Whatever is happening on that property, it is creating a refuge effect that extends beyond the boundary lines. The federal land adjacent to her property is seeing benefits because the pressure has been removed. She paused before adding the final observation. Sometimes the law is not enough. Sometimes boundaries require something more direct to be effective. The district supervisor, a career bureaucrat who preferred measurable outcomes to moral ambiguity, studied the data for a long moment. His response was pragmatic in the way that government officials learn to be when results matter more than methods. Whatever is working, we do not interfere. If that sector maintains 0 violations, we reallocate enforcement resources to areas with active problems. If Ms. Castellane's presence is deterring illegal activity, that serves our mission. We do not ask questions we do not want answered. The meeting moved on to other sectors, other problems, but the map remained on the wall. Sector 7 glowed clean, while other areas bled red with ongoing violations. Sheriff Tannick sat in his office on a cold afternoon in late autumn, filing away the last documents related to the case. The folder was thick with reports, search records, medical examiner findings, and witness statements that said everything and nothing. Each page represented hours of investigation, thousands of dollars in resources, and ultimately led to conclusions that satisfied procedure while avoiding truth. He placed it in a filing cabinet marked with the year and locked it. The key went into his desk drawer, where it would remain unless someone with higher authority demanded access. Deputy Freeman entered without knocking, a habit Tannick had stopped trying to correct years ago. We ever going back up there? Tannic closed the cabinet and turned. Only if she calls us, which she will not need to. Freeman leaned against the doorframe, the posture of someone who had been thinking about something for a long time and finally decided to ask. You really think she did what everyone says? Did she really drive those men to their deaths without touching them? Tannic considered the question with the weight it deserved. He had been a sheriff for 18 years. He had investigated murders and accidents and everything in between. He had learned to distinguish between what happened and what could be proven, between justice and law, between truth and evidence. His answer reflected that experience. I think 5 men ignored clearly posted warnings on isolated private property. I think they harassed and threatened a woman who had every legal right to defend herself. I think they entered terrain they thought they understood and encountered something they were completely unprepared for. What the something was, I cannot prove and would not testify to, if I could. Freeman was not satisfied with diplomatic answers. But you believe it. You believe she used her military training to hunt them, to drive them into the forest until they died. Tannic walked to the window that overlooked the main street of their small town. Pickup trucks and SUVs lined the curbs. People went about their business in a community where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were currency. He spoke without turning around. I believe that woman earned a Navy Cross for actions so classified the citation itself is redacted. I believe she saved 12 hostages by eliminating 7 armed hostiles in a sandstorm from positions that should have made accurate shooting impossible. I believe she was part of operations that required precision and ruthlessness in equal measure. He turned back to Freeman. I believe she left that life and bought the most remote property she could find because she wanted peace, wanted distance from violence and conflict and the things she had done in service of her country. And I believe when men violated that peace repeatedly, ignored every warning, and threatened her in her own home, she made a decision. She chose to defend her boundaries using the skills she possessed. Whether that defense was active or passive, whether she hunted them or simply made them believe they were being hunted, the result was the same. 5 men entered her property after months of warnings, and 3 days later, they were dead. Freeman absorbed this. So, we just let it go? Tannic returned to his desk and sat down heavily. What would you have me do? Arrest her for what? Defending her property? Scaring trespassers? The medical examiner found no evidence of foul play, no gunshot wounds, no trauma. Consistent with assault, they died of exposure on federal land miles from her boundary. Every piece of evidence supports accidental death. The only thing that suggests otherwise is circumstantial, timing, pattern. The fact that experienced hunters suddenly became lost and terrified. None of that would survive a preliminary hearing, let alone trial. He pulled out another folder, this one containing background information he had gathered through unofficial channels. Look at who those men were. Breck Holloway had 3 domestic violence arrests. Beat his wife badly enough to put her in the hospital twice. Charges dropped both times because she was too afraid to testify. Cullen Mays was under investigation for running an illegal game meat operation, selling protected species to restaurants, making thousands of dollars off wildlife that belonged to the public. Harlan Vickers did 2 years for aggravated assault. Put a man in a coma over a bar argument. These were not innocent victims. These were predators who thought they had found prey. Freeman looked at the folder, but did not touch it. So, they deserved what they got? Tannic closed the folder. I am not making that judgment. I am saying that when predators encounter something higher on the food chain, the outcome is predictable. Those men spent years violating boundaries because there were never consequences. They had learned that the law could not reach them in these mountains. That isolation meant immunity. Then they encountered someone who did not need the law, someone who could enforce boundaries directly. And they learned too late that some people are not helpless just because they are alone. Freeman stood in silence for a long moment before speaking again. What if she does it again? What if someone else crosses her fence? Tannic met his eyes. Then they will have ignored signs, warnings, and the well-known story of what happened to the last people who made that choice. At that point, it is not a failure of law enforcement. It is natural selection. Freeman left without another word. Tannic returned to his paperwork. The case was closed. Justice, by whatever definition one chose to apply, had been served. Winter settled in early, as it often did in the high country. The first significant snow fell in mid-October, blanketing the peaks and making the access roads treacherous. By November, Embry's cabin was accessible only by snowmobile or on foot, and even those options were limited to people with serious winter skills. The isolation she had sought when purchasing the property became absolute. No casual visitors, no unexpected guests, just the mountain, the snow, and the silence that came with both. She stood on her porch one afternoon as the latest storm moved in, coffee steaming in her hands, watching clouds roll over the ridgeline like a slow tide. The weather forecast called for 18 inches. The temperature was already dropping. This storm would close the road completely for at least a week. She had supplies for 3 months if necessary. The generator was serviced and fueled. The firewood was stacked. She was prepared for isolation in a way that most people could not imagine, let alone endure. A vehicle approached, struggling through snow that had already accumulated to dangerous depths. She recognized it before it reached the clearing. Sheriff Tannock, alone, driving a heavy truck with chains on all 4 tires. He was the only person who had visited her property since the incident, the only person who knew what she had done, or suspected strongly enough that it amounted to knowing, and had chosen to look the other way. She waited as he parked and made his way up the steps, carrying a small box with care that suggested its contents mattered. He did not speak immediately, just handed her the box and waited while she opened it. Inside was her Navy cross, properly mounted and framed, with the official citation visible beneath the metal. The citation was brief, heavy on classified redactions, but what remained was enough. For extraordinary heroism in combat operations. For actions under fire that resulted in the successful extraction of 12 civilian hostages, for demonstrated valor in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. The language was bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear. She had earned this through blood and skill, and a willingness to do what others could not. "How did you manage this?" Embry asked, her voice quiet. Tannock shrugged. "I know some people, made some calls. Your record was sealed for operational security, but enough time has passed that certain acknowledgments can be made. The Navy keeps track of its decorated personnel, even when those decorations are classified. They were willing to release this for display with appropriate redactions. I figured you should have it, not hidden away in a file somewhere, but here, where you can see it." Embry looked at the metal without removing it from the case. The metal gleamed against blue velvet. The ribbon was pristine. It represented a day in the desert when she had taken 7 shots and saved 12 lives and lost the woman who had been her spotter and closest friend. It represented years of service that had cost her more than anyone who had not lived it could understand. "I did not want recognition," she said. Tannock nodded. "I know, but you earned it, and more importantly, you earned the right to choose what to do with it. Display it, hide it, burn it. That is your choice, but you should have it." He handed her a second envelope. This one was from the County Fish and Wildlife Commission. The letter was formal, typed on official letterhead, signed by 3 commissioners. It thanked her for her cooperation in reducing poaching activity in Sector 7. 18 months without a single incident. First time in over a decade. The wildlife population recovery was measurable and significant. The reduction in illegal activity had allowed them to reallocate enforcement, resources to other areas. They wanted to formally acknowledge her contribution to conservation efforts in the region. She read the letter twice before looking up. "They are thanking me for buying land?" Tannock leaned against the porch rail, his breath visible in the cold air. "They are thanking you for making it clear that boundaries matter, that some lines are not suggestions, that there are consequences for people who think isolation means vulnerability. They cannot say that directly, cannot acknowledge what everyone knows happened, but they understand that your presence has changed the dynamic in this region. Poaching has stopped, wildlife is recovering, the forest is healthier. However that outcome was achieved, they recognize its value." Embry set the letter down on the porch rail. The consequences were theirs to choose. "I posted signs, filed reports, documented months of harassment. They decided warnings did not apply to them, that a woman alone could not enforce boundaries. They were wrong." Tannock agreed. "And now your fence line is treated like it is electrified. Nobody approaches it without explicit permission. Nobody questions it. Nobody crosses it. I have not received a single trespassing complaint from this area in 18 months. Not one. That is unprecedented. He turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at her. Those men who died. Official record says accident, exposure, poor decisions and bad conditions. That is how it will stay in every file, every report, every official document. But I wanted you to know that nobody else is going to make their mistakes. Word is out. Your land is sacred ground now, not because of what anyone knows for certain, but because of what everyone suspects. And sometimes suspicion is more effective than proof, Embry asked quietly. What do people suspect? Tannick smiled without humor. They suspect that you are exactly what your service record suggests, a person trained to eliminate threats with precision and without trace. A person who understands how to use terrain and psychology and fear as weapons more effective than bullets. A person who will defend her boundaries with the same ruthless efficiency she once used to defend hostages in a foreign desert. They suspect that 5 men crossed your fence and you made them believe they were being hunted until terror drove them to death without you ever firing a shot. And whether that suspicion is accurate or not, it serves the same purpose. It keeps people away. He descended the steps and stopped at his truck. Before getting in, he looked back one final time. Thank you for your service, Chief Petty Officer Castellane. Both times. The first time when you wore the uniform and saved lives under fire, and the second time when you drew a line here and made it mean something. This mountain is better for your presence. This county is better. And those of us who understand what really happened are grateful, even if we can never say so officially. She nodded. Once, the minimal acknowledgement of someone who had learned not to need words when action spoke clearly. He drove away, tire tracks filling with fresh snow behind him almost immediately. Within an hour, they would be completely covered, as if he had never been there at all. Embry watched until the truck disappeared around the bend in the road, then went inside. The cabin was warm, the fire burning steady, the lamp casting yellow light across familiar spaces. She placed the Navy Cross on the mantel with deliberate care. Beside it sat the photograph that had been face down for years, hidden from view because looking at it had been too painful. She picked up the photograph and studied it for the first time in months. 8 people in desert camouflage, weapons slung, standing in front of a transport vehicle. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. They were smiling despite the heat and exhaustion and danger that was constant in that place. She was 4th from the left, younger than, harder in some ways, but softer in others. The woman next to her, Staff Sergeant Reina Cortez, had been her spotter for 3 years, best shot caller she had ever worked with. They had been closer than sisters, bonded by shared danger and absolute trust. Reina had died on the operation that earned the medal, not from enemy fire, from an IED on the extraction road. One moment she had been there, walking point, confident and alert. The next moment, she was gone, vaporized by explosives that left nothing to bring home except dog tags and memories. Embry had completed the mission, had taken the shots required, had ensured the hostages reached safety. But she had left part of herself in that desert, buried under sand and grief, and the kind of loss that never fully healed. She traced Reina's face with one finger, remembering her voice calling wind corrections, confirming ranges, providing the steady stream of information that made impossible shots possible. Then she set the photograph upright on the mantel for the first time since buying the property. The past deserved acknowledgement, the dead deserved to be remembered, and she was finally ready to let them be visible again, instead of hidden away where pain could not reach. The weeks that followed established a new rhythm. Winter deepened, the snow accumulated. The temperature dropped to levels that would kill an unprepared person in hours. But Embry thrived in the isolation. She walked her fence line on snowshoes, checking that the weight of snow had not damaged any posts. She maintained the trail cameras, ensuring they remained functional through the cold. She split firewood and hauled water, and did the 1,000 small tasks that survival at this elevation required. Her body was leaner now than it had been in the service, adapted to the constant physical demands of mountain living. The animals grew bolder. Deer grazed within sight of the cabin, accustomed to her presence and assured of her indifference to them. Ravens became regular visitors, perching on the porch rail and accepting scraps she left out. Once, a mountain lion passed through her property, visible on the trail cameras, but avoiding the cabin itself. The wildlife understood something humans had to learn through harder lessons. This land had boundaries, and those boundaries were respected by everything that lived here. She spent evenings reading by lamplight, working through books she had collected over the years, but never had time to read during her service. History, philosophy, poetry that spoke to experiences she recognized, even when the contexts were different. She was learning to live with silence, with solitude, with the absence of mission objectives and operational timelines. It was harder than combat in some ways. Combat had clarity, enemies and objectives and rules of engagement that, however complex, defined success and failure. Peace was more ambiguous. Success was measured in days that passed without incident, in boundaries that held, in the slow accumulation of quiet that could, if she allowed it, become something like contentment. The photograph on the mantel became a touchstone. She found herself pausing in front of it, remembering specific operations, specific moments when everything had hung on a single shot. Raina's voice in her ear, wind at 6 miles per hour from the northwest, range 1,400 meters. Target is stationary, clear to engage. The familiar ritual of breathing, of finding the space between heartbeats, of pressing the trigger with pressure so gentle it was almost thought rather than action. The kick of recoil, the confirmation a moment later. Target down, mission successful. Then the extraction, the debrief, the endless cycle of preparation and execution that had defined her adult life. That life was over now. Those missions were completed or abandoned or reassigned to someone else. She was 46 years old and living alone on a mountain, and some days that felt like failure, while other days it felt like the only victory that mattered. The men who had crossed her fence had forced her to use skills she had hoped to leave behind, had made her become, however briefly, the predator she had been trained to be. She did not regret it, could not afford regret when survival had demanded action, but she carried it the way she carried everything from her service, as weight, as responsibility, as cost. The sound of snowmobiles approaching broke her reflection one afternoon in late January. She moved to the window, hand instinctively checking for the rifle that leaned near the door. 2 machines riding slowly, staying carefully on the access road and showing no indication of approaching her cabin uninvited. They stopped at the boundary line, clearly visible from her position. 2 figures dismounted. One pulled out binoculars and appeared to be glassing her property from a distance. The other set up what looked like surveying equipment. She watched for 20 minutes. They stayed on public land, made no move to cross her fence. Eventually, one of them waved in the direction of her cabin, a gesture that seemed more acknowledgement than threat. Then they packed up their equipment and left the way they had come. She checked the trail cameras later. The footage showed them clearly, county surveyors updating boundary markers. They had been doing their job and had stayed scrupulously on their side of the property line, the kind of respect she had demanded and earned. Spring arrived with reluctance, as it always did at this elevation. The snow retreated in stages, exposing ground that had been frozen for months. Streams that had been silent under ice began to flow again, filling the air with the sound of moving water. Green emerged in patches, tentative at first, then spreading with the confidence of life that had survived another winter. Embry walked her property and found it unchanged except for the natural wear that weather inflicted on everything. The fence posts stood straight. The signs remained legible. The cameras had captured months of wildlife footage, but not a single human trespasser. She discovered the new addition during her morning walk. Someone had placed a small cairn at the boundary line, where the access road crossed onto her property. It was well made, stable, clearly intentional. Beside it, carved into a piece of weathered wood, was a simple message: boundaries respected. The wood was old, the carving done with skill that suggested experience. She studied it for a long time, trying to determine who had left it. A hunter acknowledging the lesson learned, a local resident showing respect, or perhaps someone who had known the men who died and understood why. She left the cairn standing. It served the same purpose as the unofficial warnings that had been spray-painted on her fence posts. A reminder that this land was not open, that the signs meant exactly what they said, that crossing the boundary without permission was a choice with consequences. She photographed it for her records, then continued her walk. The mountain was waking up. Life was returning, and her boundaries, earned through clarity and consequence, remained absolute. The local newspaper ran a human interest piece that spring about the recovery of wildlife in Sector 7. The journalist interviewed rangers, wildlife biologists, and conservation officers. The story painted a picture of natural rebound, attributing the change to reduced human pressure and improved enforcement coordination. Embry's name was never mentioned. Her property was referenced only as private land that had contributed to reduced access pressures. The article quoted Ranger Ostrander saying that sometimes the best thing for wildlife recovery is leaving areas alone. The unspoken implication was clear to anyone who understood the real story. One woman's boundaries had created sanctuary for an entire ecosystem. Summer brought tourists and hikers and people who did not know the history. Some approached her fence line with the casual entitlement of people who assumed all land was accessible. They were stopped by the signs, by the cameras, by the stories their guides told when they asked if they could cut through the property. The guides all said the same thing. No, that land is private and the owner takes boundaries seriously. A few years ago, some people crossed that fence without permission. They did not survive the experience. Whether you believe that story or not, the result is the same. Nobody crosses that fence. Nobody even approaches it without good reason. Find another route. The hunting season that year was notable for what did not happen. There were no trespassing incidents in Sector 7, no complaints filed, no confrontations between landowners and hunters. The usual tension that characterized these mountains during hunting season was absent from this area, replaced by careful respect and wide margins. Groups that might have pushed boundaries in previous years gave Embry's land the kind of deference usually reserved for marked minefields or contaminated zones. They planned routes that avoided even coming close. They told stories around campfires about the woman who lived up there and what she had done, or might have done, or probably did depending on who was telling the story. The story itself evolved through repetition. Some versions had her using night vision and suppressors to stalk the men. Others claimed she had used psychological warfare, creating sounds and signs that convinced them something inhuman was hunting them. A few suggested she had done nothing except let them panic themselves to death after they realized how isolated and vulnerable they truly were. The truth, known only to Embry and perhaps suspected by Sheriff Tannick, remained unspoken. But the effect of the story, regardless of its accuracy, was undeniable. Her boundaries were respected. Absolutely. Fall arrived with the dramatic color change that high country aspens produced. Gold and red spread across the mountainsides like fire, visible for miles. The weather turned cold again. The first frost came early. Animals began their preparations for winter, storing food and seeking shelter, and following the ancient patterns that had sustained them for millennia. Embry watched the seasonal transition with the appreciation of someone who had lived through enough cycles to see the pattern beneath the change. Life continued, the mountain endured, and her place here, earned through service and defended through consequence, remained secure. She received a letter that October, forwarded through channels that suggested official origin. The return address was a post office box in Virginia. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message typed in standard government format. Chief Petty Officer Castellane. Your exemplary service continues to reflect honor upon the naval, special warfare community. While your current circumstances are known to us only through official channels, we want you to understand that the door remains open should you ever choose to return to operational status. Your skills and dedication represent the highest standards of our service. Signed with a name she recognized from her time in the teams, a commander who had led operations she had supported. A person who understood exactly what she could do and was making sure she knew the option existed. She read the letter 3 times, then burned it in her fireplace. The offer was genuine and would remain standing. If she wanted to return to that life, to operational missions and targets confirmed, and the controlled violence of special operations, a phone call would begin that process. But she had made her choice when she bought this land, had confirmed it when she left that life behind. The skills remained. The capability was unchanged, but the willingness, the desire to use those skills in service of objectives determined by others had been spent. She had drawn her own boundaries now, and they were here, marked clearly, respected finally, defended when necessary. Winter returned with the inevitability of seasons and cycles. The snow fell, the temperature dropped. The mountains settled into the long silence that would last until spring. Embry stood on her porch one evening as the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of red and orange and purple, the same colors that had filled the desert sky in that photograph on her mantle, the same beauty that existed even in harsh places, even after violence, even when the cost had been higher than anyone should have to pay. She thought about the 5 men who had crossed her fence, wondered if they had understood, in their final moments, what they had done wrong, if they had recognized that boundaries were not suggestions and warnings were not empty threats, if they had realized that a woman alone was not the same thing as a woman helpless. She would never know. Their terror and their deaths were complete. The mountain had taken them and would keep that secret along with all the others it held. What remained was the lesson, and that lesson had been learned by everyone except the men who needed it most. The last light faded. Stars emerged in the clear, cold sky. Embry went inside to the warmth and the lamplight, and the life she had built from discipline and distance, and the determined enforcement of boundaries that meant everything. The photograph on the mantel caught her eye, as it always did now. Raina smiled from the frame, frozen in that moment of youth and confidence and the camaraderie that came from shared danger. Embry raised her coffee cup in silent salute, to the dead who had earned rest, to the living who had learned boundaries, to the mountain that kept its secrets, and to peace, however it was won. The screen faded slowly to black, the image of the cabin glowing in the darkness. Like a beacon or a warning or both, text appeared against the void. In the 3 years following these events, not a single trespassing incident was reported on the Morrison Range. Embry Castellane still lives there, alone, undisturbed. Her fence has never been crossed again. The final image returned one last time, the fence post in dawn light, the metal sign catching the first rays of sun. Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted. But everyone who saw it understood the real message beneath the legal language. These boundaries are real. These warnings are promises. And the woman who drew these lines has the capability and willingness to enforce them in ways the law never could. The voiceover returned for the final time, quieter now, reflective rather than narrative. Have you ever known someone who drew a line and made it mean something? Someone whose quiet strength was mistaken for weakness until circumstances proved otherwise? Someone who demonstrated that boundaries matter most when they are tested, and that consequences, when clearly communicated and consistently enforced, create the foundation for respect. The mountains remember what happened here. The hunters remember. The wildlife that has reclaimed this land remembers in its own way. And Embry Castellane lives in peace because she made it clear that peace has a price and she was willing to pay it. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the nature of boundaries and consequences and the difference between law and justice, consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. Stories of people who stood their ground when standing ground was the only option left. Stories of quiet strength that changed everything without asking for recognition or permission. Share your thoughts below. Tell us about people you have known who drew lines that mattered. And remember that some boundaries exist for good reason. Respecting them is wisdom. Crossing them is a choice. And choices, especially those made in defiance of clear warnings, carry consequences that cannot be avoided or appealed. The final frame held on the image of Embry's property from a distance, the cabin barely visible among the trees, the fence line clear even from far away, the mountain rising behind it all, indifferent and eternal. Then it faded completely, leaving only darkness and the lingering question of what had really happened in those 72 hours when 5 men entered her land and terror drove them to death. Some questions have answers that cannot be spoken. Some truths are too dangerous to confirm. And some people, once crossed, become lessons that last generations. The Morrison Range had learned its lesson. The boundaries there were real now, and they would remain real as long as Embry Castellane walked her fence line each morning, documenting and maintaining and defending the peace she had earned through service and sacrifice, and the unwavering enforcement of lines that others had tried and failed to erase.